Thank you all. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. First, because I was actually born right here in Chicago, so I've come home. And second, because you so graciously arranged this wonderful rain to bring me back to my adopted home of Oregon. So thank you for that. And third, because of course, as everybody knows, this week, the intellectual capital of the world is right here in Chicago, right? Well, that moment that is terrifying, exciting, awe-inspiring, when a conviction or an emotion, an action or outside power forces us to make a decision that redirects life onto a whole new path. It's a turning point when we learn the lesson about how the simplest little push can move our entire world. The speakers who are joining us this evening have had this experience and are here to share their unique lessons. They'll share the defining moments that force them to reflect on their lives and forge new paths. The lessons shared tonight will provide a new lens on family, career, and the pursuit of happiness in the modern world. Well, I'd like to save the best for last, which means starting with me. So, people often wonder how it is that a New York Times columnist, and maybe a man to boot, should end up writing so much about human rights, and especially about empowering women around the world. And so, let me tell you a little bit about the roots of that. As you may know, I've written a lot about sex trafficking, and that was all kind of an accident. It originated when I thought I was writing one article about girls who had been prostituted in Cambodia, and then I spent an afternoon in a brothel interviewing a 14 and 15-year-old girl. The 14-year-old had been sold by her stepfather. The 15-year-old had been kidnapped by a neighbor and sold to the brothel, and they were locked up inside. If they had tried to run away, the police would have arrested them and handed them right back. And as I interviewed them and spent hour after hour getting their life story, I found that after the 15-year-old went missing, her mother had searched all over Cambodia to try to find her. And in Cambodia, if your teenage daughter goes missing, the places you look are in the red light district. So just a week before I got there, her mother had come to that red light district and into that brothel. And they'd had this joyous reunion. And so in my naivete, I said, well, then why are you still here? Why didn't your mother take you home? And she explained that the brothel owner, who was a woman, that the brothel owner said that she had paid good money for me, and my mother would have to buy me back. My mother didn't have the money. I just could not believe that this was happening. And I walked out of the brothel knowing that I had a good front page story and that these two girls were going to end up staying there and dying of AIDS. And it seemed horribly unfair, and frankly, it felt a little bit exploitative on my part of two girls who were being exploited by visiting men every day. And so, by now I'm sure that those two girls have died of AIDS, but they haunted me, and that led me to go back and write about others. And then that made me curious about trafficking right here in the US. And so many of the themes that I pursued, it started with some people I met, a story that I wrote about originally, and one that then was very hard to put down and just to leave to go back to writing about international exchange rates. They haunt you, these people. And, sometimes I think there's a perception that these are these two-dimensional victims out there. There's so much more than that. One of the people who left a very deep impression on me was a woman I met in Darfur, who I interviewed. And the backdrop is that, people often ask if I get scared in my reporting. Boy, I get terrified, often. But the people that, at the end of the day, I have a certain amount of protection as a foreign journalist, if only that I have ransom value. My interpreter, my driver, and the people I write about have no protection. They get none of the credit, they take all of the risks. And think about that more broadly when you read reporting from Syria, from Iraq, from other hot zones. Those local people who facilitate our reporting are essential to that news process. But in Darfur, the challenge was how to write about sexual violence in a way that would get people to pay attention, which meant you needed to put a human face on it. You needed an individual story. If you just wrote about hundreds of people, then the world shrugged. You needed those individual stories. But on the other hand, the moment you put an individual face on it, that person was at risk of stigma and at risk of legal punishment, at risk of revenge from the Janjaweed. And there was one woman named Suad Ahmed who I met in a refugee camp, this Darfuri women who have been outside a refugee camp gathering firewood with her 14-year-old sister. When she saw the Janjaweed militia approaching, she told her sister, her 14-year-old sister, run back to camp. And then she made a diversion of herself going in the other direction so that the Janjaweed would see her. It worked. Her sister was able to escape safely back to camp because the militia ran after Suad. They caught her. 8 of them gang raped her. They brutally beat her. When they had left, the people from the camp went out and carried her back to the camp. And this is an area of deeply conservative mores where women who have been raped are sometimes divorced, sometimes have to live in a little hut outside the village. But she wanted to tell me that story, and she kept saying that it was okay if I wrote about it. And I was torn because, on the one hand, I wanted an individual story to make this issue come alive. On the other hand, how meaningful was the consent she was giving to me? This is a woman who didn't know anything about the New York Times, who had never seen the internet, who didn't perhaps appreciate the consequences of what she was saying. And so I kept asking her about telling her story, and finally I said, well, why do you want me to write your story? And she said, this is the only way I have to fight back against the militias who are raping and killing us. This is the only way I have to fight back by telling my story. And so I understood, and I indeed used it. I thought that she was making a decision, understanding it, and I so admire that kind of courage. And I think of people like that who I've met in so many places who have encouraged me to keep on reporting, to keep telling these stories in hopes that at the margins it does make some kind of a difference. Now, I sometimes think that the challenges that we face have to do in part with the ways in which we psych ourselves out. And I think one is the view that these issues are also incredibly depressing, whether it's genocide or trafficking or global poverty. And maybe it's partly the way we in journalism cover these global issues, that we cover planes that crash, not planes that take off. And so the perception is that all planes are always crashing all the time. In the context of aviation, people understand that. In the context of the globe, people don't necessarily. And In fact, I managed to come back from these trips actually sometimes reassured about the human capacity to do good, because side by side with the worst of human nature, you invariably see the very best. So you see those Janjaweed militias, but you also see the courage of Suad. On one trip to Eastern Congo, the most lethal conflict since World War II, I met a warlord who was slaughtering people, sending his troops to rape people, and he underscored the human capacity for evil. But there was this incredible Polish nun who was there, who had stayed on when other aid workers were evacuated, and she was single-handedly feeding these orphans, running a school, negotiating with the warlord to keep him at bay out of her town. And I mean, boy, I came back and I just wanted to grow up to become a Polish nun. She reflected the way humans can express their humanity sometimes when they're truly tested with courage, with resilience, with strength, and with altruism. And in contrast, in this country, we're not tested. And so we sometimes express our humanity by getting the latest cell phone or a hot car. That's what's depressing. One of the obstacles in in galvanizing change is, if you will, an empathy gap. So many of these issues seem so far away, so remote from our lives, whether they're halfway around the world or whether they're right next door. And this empathy gap, I think, is sometimes even greater than the gaps of inequality around us. When we were writing A Path to Peers, Cheryl and I noted that the wealthiest 20% of Americans actually donate less to charity as a proportion of their income than the poorest 20%. And I don't think it's because the wealthy are intrinsically less empathetic or less compassionate or less good, but rather, if you were affluent, then you can largely insulate yourself from need. You live in a nice neighborhood, you don't have a lot of needy neighbors. On the other hand, if you were poor in America today, every day you encounter people who are even needier than you are. And so it becomes possible for those who are successful to tune out needs, and even sometimes to come to the conclusion that poverty is not an economic failing, but a moral failing, and to resist helping for that reason. One of the people who I came to really admire is a librarian in Northwest Arkansas, Mrs. Grady. Now, she had a African-American student named Ollie Neal, who we tell about in A Path to Peers. Ollie was a very, very bright kid, but he was a troublemaker. He got fired from his job at a store for shoplifting. He was always mouthing off in school. He made Mrs. Grady cry. And then one day he's skipping English class, and he goes to this library that Mrs. Grady has set up. And he sees this novel on the shelf by an African-American author named Frank Yerby. And it catches his eye partly because it has a risque cover, a woman with a top that doesn't cover very much by 1957 standards, but probably by today's standards, it's, it covers absolutely everything imaginable. But it catches his eye, and so he looks at it and he kind of thinks, oh, it might be nice to read. And on the other hand, though, he's a tough kid, Ollie is. And a tough kid doesn't read books. So he puts it under his jacket, he steals it. He takes it home, he reads it, he loves it. And he returns it a week later, puts it back on the shelf where it had been, and he sees there's another book by Frank Yerby, another novel. So he steals that one. A week or so later, he returns that one, and he sees there was a third book that he hadn't noticed, also by Frank Yerby, so he steals that. And eventually this happens 4 times. He becomes a reader. He graduates to more literary fiction, to current events. He ends up going to college, to law school. He becomes one of Arkansas's first African-American lawyers. He devotes his life to helping disadvantaged kids like the one that he had been. He eventually becomes a prosecutor and a judge. And at one of his high school reunions, he tells Mrs. Grady, you know, it's your little library that turned my life around. But I have to confess, I stole some of your books. And she says, well, I have a confession too. I saw you steal that first book. And she had been about to confront him. She was angry. You know, why are you stealing a book when you can just check it out? And then she understood in a flash of insight that he was ashamed to be checking out a book. So she let him steal it. That weekend, she drove 70 miles to Memphis, to the used bookstores there, to look for another book by Frank Yerby, in hopes that this kid who had made her cry might like that first one and might perhaps want another. The first used bookstore didn't have one. She went to another. Finally, the third or fourth bookstore had another. She bought it with her own money, put it back on the shelf, and when Ollie Neal stole that second book, she was thrilled. Then she went back to Memphis, bought another book, put it back, and this happened one more time after that. And, you know, she took a risk on this kid. I think any of us who've been engaged in these efforts knows that helping people is harder than it looks. Sometimes it doesn't always work. Sometimes you get your heart broken. But sometimes you truly can take a risk on somebody if you do have that empathy. And it works, and then it reverberates through that person's life and the lives of so many other people. Now, one objection that I sometimes hear is that, well, it's all kind of a drop in the bucket. And it's true. I mean, Mrs. Grady didn't solve the problem of African American disadvantage, of too few kids going to college. No. And at the end of the day, none of us are going to solve any of these major problems. What we are going to do is, in a sense, a drop in the bucket. But one of the ways in which I look at it has to do with my own dad. My dad was a World War II refugee. He escaped to Romania, to Yugoslavia, eventually Paris. He was cleaning hotel rooms after World War II, including one that a young American woman was occupying for a summer while she worked for the Marshall Plan. And she liked him. She convinced her parents back in Oregon that they should sponsor his way to come to the U.S. And they had never met him, but they took a risk on him. That didn't solve the global problem of refugees. It didn't make a dent in the global problem of refugees. But for him, it was totally transformative. And I wouldn't be here if they hadn't taken that risk, if they hadn't had that empathy. And in some sense, I think that perhaps I'm trying to pay it forward. And finally, I want to offer an appeal to you from the heart that has to do with journalism today. To make progress on so many of these issues of social justice, making the world a better place that we care about, it's crucial that they be on the agenda. And traditionally, that is one thing that we in the news media did. One of my concerns is that as the news media loses its business model, that we are dropping the ball on these issues. The truth is that an executive producer of a TV program can send a camera crew half a world away to cover some global crisis. But if they do, it'll be expensive and dangerous, and the ratings will drop compared to another channel that puts a Democrat and a Republican in a room together and has them yell at each other. One of the things that I found most dispiriting was that the Gates Foundation essentially bribed ABC News to cover global health and nutrition issues. It wasn't called a bribe, it was called a grant, but you get the idea. And at the end of that, ABC did great stuff. And then at the end of the year, ABC decided not to renew the grant because they could tell from their metrics that when they ran these important, great stories, that's when people were switching to the other channels. So I don't think that we're going to be able to rely on the news media to cover these important issues to the same degree. And that creates a vacuum. And I hope that all of you will in your own way, whether it's through your Facebook accounts or your Twitter accounts, or through the conversations you have with friends and colleagues, will help to shine a spotlight on some of these global and local issues, because unless they are spotlighted by all of us, then it becomes very difficult to make progress on them. Thank you very much.